Um, anyway, we, as you all know, we live in extremely interesting times. Our world is changing fundamentally in a way that it hasn't changed in centuries. So we have to be psychologically ready for massive changes coming our way. But what makes it in some ways even more difficult to prepare for these changes is the fact that the civilization, and this is in response to your question about where's the West lost it, the civilization that led the world for the last 200 years is losing its way in a very profound way. And I say this because if there was one gift that Western civilization shared with the rest of humanity, it's what I call the gift of rationality. The West said, oh, we believe that in everything you do, you have to base it on evidence. You have to be reasonable and logical in whatever you do. And you must check and verify any information you have, right? In the search for objective truth. And yet, despite all these fundamental maxims of Western civilization, the West is acting irrationally at a time when it should be acting more rationally. And I'll give you three concrete examples, huge examples of irrationality. The first example, we know that the world has changed because it's become a small, interdependent world, right? We are hugely connected. And so, to use a simple boat analogy, in the past, when 8 billion people live in 193 separate countries, they were living on 193 separate boats, right? Separate from each other. So if one boat caught COVID, other boats wouldn't catch COVID. They're separated. But the world has shrunk. The 8 billion of us live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. So when one cabin catches COVID, all 193 cabins catch COVID. It's so obvious. Now, what happens if you're all living on the same boat? What's the most irrational thing you can do? The most irrational thing you can do is when your boat is sinking as a result of climate change, instead of trying to save the boat, you argue about whose cabin is more beautiful. You know, there's an old expression, English expression, there's no point rearranging the deck chairs when the Titanic is going down. That's irrational. But that's what the West is doing. For the United States to launch its geopolitical contests against China when the planet is in peril is hugely irresponsible and hugely irrational. And what's shocking is that the West has the leading universities, the leading think tanks, the leading media channels, and they don't point out that this is irrational behavior. That's just one example. The second example is that what's so obvious is that history has turned a fundamental corner this century. And what was the norm for the past 200 years is not going to be the norm in this century. So, for example, amazingly enough, 100 years ago, in 1924, a few Europeans could run the world effortlessly. 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indian ancestors of mine, just like that, effortlessly, right? Europe could run the world. But European power has diminished. One statistic. In the year 1980, the combined EU GDP was 10 times the size of China. 10 times. Now it's the same size as China. And by 2050, Europe will be half that of China. Now, when you have these massive shifts of power happening, surely you should look for rational ways and means of adjusting. Is that happening? It's not. Another sign of irrationality on their part. And the third sign of irrationality is this. If you had to decide what's the most important priority of any society, the most important priority for any society anywhere in the world should be to improve the well-being of its own population, right? If you had to make a choice between X and well-being, you say, no, I must take care of the well-being of your people, of my people. And yet, paradoxically, United States, which is the most rational society on planet Earth, at a time when the average standard of living of the bottom 50% of the American population has stagnated for 3 decades, and the priority should be to take care of the bottom 50%, instead of focusing on people, the United States says primacy is more important than people. Any country that chooses primacy over the well-being of its own people is making an irrational decision, and nobody questions it.
Well, Kishore, you